As Dr. Hlabachova just said, my name is Alfonso Medina. You may ask why not Urrea. That's because Hispanics usually have two last names, and the second one is our mother's last name. We use it, but still our family name is Medina, so you can call me Medina Urrea or Medina. We're still a patriarchal society, so we go by the women's, the father's lineage. This talk is work in progress, so you will probably find that I am more passionate in some places that maybe I should be, but I think it is very interesting, and it could be applied to many, many, many languages. As as a brief description of what I will be talking about, I will tell you a little bit of language engineering in Mexico, who does language engineering in Mexico. I will briefly mention the fact that we have many, many languages in Mexico, and then I will try to justify the study of word segmentation techniques in order to study all these languages. I will propose this idea of a morphological profile, which is nothing other than a table of morphemes automatically extracted from a corpus with statistical methods, an unsupervised approach. And then the idea of measuring different tables from different corpora in order to find distances that could be helpful in telling us what morphemes are more typical of what corpora, of what dialects, and what different languages, because genetically related languages share a lot of morphemes. I will show you some of the data that I got from Portuguese and Spanish. Then I will have some final remarks. First of all, the Grupo de Ingeniería Lingüística, I usually try not to translate it because we don't have another name in English, but I'll show you a picture of who we are. We are actually two researchers and a lot of students. We have someone from Venezuela spending a couple of months there. And I don't see our leader of the group. I think he's behind. Where is he? I picked the wrong picture, I'm sorry. But the group, in fact, has a lot of students from linguistics, actually Hispanic linguistics, and a lot of students from engineering and computer science. So we in Mexico do not have the experience that the US or Europe has about language engineering, and we have very little resources, but nevertheless, and we are very few in spite of the size of the group, which is not complete in this picture. Nevertheless, we try to do our best, and I hope you can appreciate it. We have at least two kinds of projects. One of them is compilation of corpora. To you, it may be too easy a task, maybe, because you have the national corpus of Czech, which I'm sure it was a difficult task to gather a corpus that could be called national. We're still working with the fundamentals of doing a corpus. We're tagging everything in XML, and we're dealing with a historical corpus, which I will mention later, called CHEM. It has documents of the Spanish language written in Mexico from the 16th century till the 19th century. We also are interested in specialized discourse in order to do terminology extraction and social dialects, such as the corpus of sexualities in Mexico. Everyone likes to talk about sexuality in Mexico, and there is no terminology Not even sexologists have an appropriate terminology to refer to the study. So these are basic resources that we need in order to work further engineering, language engineering projects. We have other corpora, some of them from the native Mexican languages, mainly the Uto-Aztecan family to which Aztec belongs. We have a couple of Mayan corpora. Chug is the name of it, that's spoken in Guatemala. And we're very fortunate to have a lot of anthropologists in Mexico that have been gathering corpora for decades. We only need to find them, which is not easy. The other important project has to do with extraction of definitional contexts, what we call definitional contexts. If you can extract from a corpus information about definitions, that means terms and definitions, then you can probably make an automatic construction of a dictionary, of a terminology dictionary. So I have this piece of text that if you make a terminology extraction, you probably are familiar with more than one method of extracting terms, then you can simply tag it. Well, it just happens from our observations of corpora that normally around a term, there might be certain clues that let us know if a definition is there, it's contained. So certain patterns like according to so-and-so, and certain verbal patterns like is defined as, tell us almost 100% that the definition is somewhere around. So not only that, the fact that the definition is, or a kind of definition is there, allows us to many a time determine what the Aristotelian structure of a definition, many times it occurs, so it can automatically be found where the genus of the definition is, or where the differentia. So we are doing a lot of work of this. This is not unsupervised, but of course it requires a lot of work, and we're trying to make it as automatic as possible. Talking about the projects, then I will give you a panorama of what the languages of Mexico are. There are over 100 native American languages indigenous to Mexico. And actually there are fewer families to which they belong, but they're not sensed. Does one say sensed? A sense? They're not accounted for. They don't even know. But the fact is that one language is not intelligible from the other, and that makes them very different, even though they may be related. Needless to say, in a situation like this, we have a very diverse morphological context, and I think that all these languages need some sort of technologies that can be used for these populations to take advantage of them. Some of them, the most immediate, the necessary ones, had to do with synthesis. When someone's mute and needs to say something, then a synthesizer could be helpful for these languages that nobody really has studied from a computational point of view. And one of the first things to do when you are confronted with so many different languages and so diverse a set of morphological phenomena, then you realize that you have to find a way to segment words so that you can extract morphemes. My original work was with Spanish, so you're probably familiar with Spanish since it is related distantly to Czech, but you probably know Italian, French, and so there are some interesting things that I did there that was, let me go on. I just want to talk about segmentation techniques. You're probably aware of Harris as being the first linguist who, in the 50s, started to automatically or propose automatic means for morphological segmentation of words. He stresses a lot the importance of uncertainty as a criteria to segment morphologically graphical words. There are many approaches. One of the 60s is by the Russian Andreev, which tried to work with mere frequencies, and he applied it to Vietnamese, Russian, probably Czech too. I'm not very sure. Then in the 70s came up this method dealing with economy. Joseph de Kock is from Belgium. But I think entropy-based approaches are probably the most common. They're, for information retrieval purposes, entropy is usually mentioned as one way of segmenting words. Goldsmith from Chicago has a best fit model, a minimum distance model. And Kreutz and Lagus from Finland have applied an interesting method, Bayesian statistics, in order to segment words. And all of these are worth looking into because they rest upon one or another interesting aspect of language. What applications are possible for word segmentation? I just said linguistic research. Discovering morphemes of a language in a corpus, it would be a first step in order to learn what the language is represented in a corpus. And that's in fact what linguists in the Bloomfieldian linguists used to do. They used to collect corpora from the languages spoken in America, and they would try to discover first what the phonemes are with permutational techniques, and then what the morphemes are, and that's something that is still done manually in Mexico in anthropological linguistic schools. From a more technical point of view, it can benefit part of speech tagging. We have a student working with a Brill tagger that, as you know, takes into account the last letters, not really morphemes, 3 or 4 letters. You tell how many letters to take into account, and the first 2 or 3 or 4 letters of the word in order to find out or generate rules that had to do with those beginnings and endings of the word. I think that could be improved if you knew beforehand what the morphemes are, rather than having to test, well, I need 8 characters because my longest set of affix chain is about 10 characters. So making an automatic search of all these letters may be costly and unnecessary, actually. In speech synthesis, there is this method called unit selection, which has to do with recording certain prominent parts of discourse and then just play them back at synthesis. But if you don't know what those prominent units are, then you don't know what to record, and you're forced to recording all the words or a close set of words, but or to rely on diphones, which would not permit you to have a soft playback of the synthesis, the speech synthesis. So let me just start telling you some of what we have done in order to segment morphologically graphical words. The idea is to generate a candidate list of morphemes. Naturally, not everything in that list will be a real morpheme, but you can order this list according to some criteria that will let you get the most likely to be affixes towards the beginning of the table and the least likely to be affixes towards the end. There are, of course, many problems. You will probably imagine the threshold problem. If you get statistical measures of how a segmentation, how morphological a segmentation is, then you probably need a threshold in order to know when is that segmentation not a morphological segmentation. And a really important problem is that graphical words are not linguistic words. You're probably familiar with functional words that really cannot appear alone and could not be considered plain words. The safe strategy that this method takes is just take the best segmentation. There will be errors anyway. And so far, what we do is apply entropy measures. You probably remember entropy as a measurement of content of information. We take some measurements of what we call square counts that was described by Joseph Greenberg in the 50s, and that actually you can trace that to Saussure. It's just a matter of making permutations of word fragments, and the economy principle due to the Koch from the 70s. The idea with economy is that bases are normally low occurring, and affixes tend to be few but occur many times. I will go into that in a minute, but briefly, if you have a great number of word segments that are not very frequent, along with a few segments that are very frequent, then you probably have an economical segmentation there with a prototypical affix in that affix and base in that border. Just briefly, you probably know what entropy is, but just in order to clarify how it is, consider that you have a word and you look into each possible segmentation, and all you do is find the probability of whatever comes after the beginning of the word and apply this formula, which is well known, and you'll find it anywhere in all statistical handbooks. The problem with this is that you'll have a lot of errors, such as hive instead of beehive. But it is surprisingly very appropriate for small corpora. Peaks of entropy, I think that's obvious, would have to do with, are related to the word segmentation, where the segmentation would occur. The square counts, you could see this more traditional linguistic structure as the combination of beginnings and endings of words, such as you can see act combines with ing or with a null morpheme. Similarly, editor, editing, and edit. So these structures are very good evidence that there is a morphological border there. There is another example down there: pre-graduate, post-graduate, prenuptial, post-nuptial, and graduate and nuptial. Economy, as I was telling you, this will clarify, this will make more clear the idea, deals with having a small set of frequent word beginnings combined with a big set of infrequent word endings. affixes would have more segments in syntagmatic relation, that's what I call companions, and less items alternating in a complementary relationship, in a paradigmatic relationship. Bases would have more paradigmatic items and less syntagmatic items. So you can do many things, but a very simple approach would be to compare how many syntagmatic versus paradigmatic items you can deal with. So that would be a formula. You can also filter out whatever you already know is a suffix, and then you would get a finer measurement of what we call economy. A similar example can be shown for those who were prefixes for suffixes. You have typically a small set of frequent word endings and a big set of unfrequent word endings. Same idea, and the formula varies because now the set A would be what your numerator would contain, and your denominator would have the number of items in set B. Well, but are they redundant? How convenient is it to use several measurements in order to find where the segmentation is? Actually, you can follow the approach of consensus by committee. If you have a committee of several measurements, you can find out where the segmentation or the best segmentation would be. But then the real important question would be if they are redundant or not. I find after observation that economy is more appropriate to finding inflection, is less appropriate to finding derivation. Outer affixes are readily found either towards the beginning or towards the end, and it is very productive in synchrony. It is more expensive because you have to find a lot of alternating paradigmatic items. Entropy, on the other hand, it is quick, cheap to calculate, and it is better for derivation. It will segment the word closer to the base, and it is not as good for inflection. You can find also very productive morphemes that are not very economical. They will come up. They will come up. Squares, on the other hand, are generally good for derivation, inflection, and very good for composition, and very productive in all of these areas, provided your corpus is good enough. I will talk about the notion of affixality. If you could, we could call it also glutinosity. You probably remember Edward Sapir, who in his book Language spoke briefly about an energy that glues morphemes and that throughout time it expands and contracts, permitting a lot of new forms to exist. Well, thinking of him, this would be a matter of glutinosity because we are measuring how these morphemes glue together, but I think glutinosity would be more appropriate to talk about morphemes in general, whereas affixality is definitely a more precise word for the relationship between affixes and bases. And the idea is to be able to measure this glutinosity between affixes and bases with some sort of unit that could be the structure that carries information in bits. But that's very preliminary because you have to find a good way to represent what a structure is of this kind. In the following experiments, I just normalized all these measurements and get a normalized value, a general affixality value from 0 to 1. So we're not really dealing with units of the kind I'm speaking, but I think it should be interesting to be able to think of this kind of measurement alternative. This is the table that we generated, Dr. Hlabachova and I, for our experiment. I show it to you because, well, maybe she has shown it to you, but I like it because it is in Czech, even though I don't have a clue of what it is. But the idea is that we have an average of normalized amounts. This is the rank, which tells us which one is the more affixal. Then you have the column of prefixes, and the frequency is really not related to the frequency of occurrence of the segment. It is related to the frequency, the number of times that segment was the best segmentation in the word. There are things to remark, like we were discussing. They look more like composition. But composition in which those items behave, at least numerically, quantitatively, as affixes. And I think that's it. Now I will speak of morphological profiles. This kind, the table I just shown you, it didn't exhibit inflectional forms because, as far as I know, Czech doesn't have inflection in prefixes, but other languages do. And normally, when you apply these techniques, the most affixal things are inflection items. And inflectional forms, I think, are the most intimate units of any language. Also, I suppose derivation too. So in order to describe a language, you should be able to look into those very frequent things that have a potential of high affixality. And in fact, you would be getting a fingerprint of the language. I'm not familiar with all these techniques that they have. Metabolomics, they are developing this technique for getting profiles of plants. This definitely has nothing to do with that, but it reminds me of the fact that maybe a language can be profiled in such a way that you get a lot of information about that language, and you can compare it to other languages, to other corpora. And you probably remember glottochronology, Swedish chronology, glottochronology, difficult word to say, which used to date languages when they ceased to be one language and became separate branches of a tree. And he used to measure in millennia when those languages were separated. Of course, that was very interesting and very, very controversial. I don't know why people don't like the approach, but like any quantitative approach, it would have problems, definitely. But it is a very interesting one. And the idea here is that there can be a measurement between different corpora, but closer together. I'm not trying to date when two languages started being different languages. I'm trying to find distances between samples of the same language. And it could be used for sociological dialects or registers like middle class, lower class, etc., or etc. I will then show you some examples. I will tell you about the experiment. The objective was to compare 3 language states. Spanish of the 16th century is really the same as in both sides of the Atlantic. Even though they were written in Mexico, they were written by Spaniards who went to Mexico. And I took those documents from the CHEM. For the 20th century, I took data from probably the best corpus there is for the Spanish language. It is for the Mexican dialect. It was compiled in El Colegio de Mexico in the 70s. Nobody knows about it, but it really is made in the image of the Brown corpus, which took care of statistical, random, aleatory criteria in order to be compiled. Corpora nowadays tend to be a collection of documents that you can generate concordances from, but they have the idea that getting a lot of documents gives you a lot of representativity when you should be thinking of a balanced corpus, balanced and representative. Well, those notions are important and shouldn't be ignored. From these samples, I generated the lists of prominent suffixes and suffixal groups. Of course, a method like this, since I'm taking only the best segmentation, it is very likely that I would have several chains of suffixes rather than just the outermost suffix. And it may be hard for you to see since you don't know Spanish, but if you Latin, maybe it would be interesting. Again, these catalogs the one I showed you for Czech are tables ordered from most affixal, exhibiting more glutinosity to less affixal, and the smaller ranks imply greater affixality glutinosity. Words of caution. It's not. It is important to say that results have to do with the representativity of a corpus is important in order for results to be appropriate or good results. And for the 16th century, there is a lot of orthographical problems, and it is very difficult to make a phonological transcription of these texts because simply orthography was different and varied from writer to writer. So this will be an exercise basically of written language. And also, those items that tend to be more affixal may be also very short and may be very polysemic. That list of items here can be morphemes that mark inflection in verbs as well as in nouns, and they mean a lot of things. So that's an important thing to notice. And also, errors of different kinds are unavoidable. When we did the Czech experiment, Dr. Hlabachova cleaned up the corpus to the best she could. But the idea is not to clean it, to leave it like that, because supposedly these, the language will emerge anyway. These things should emerge in spite of all the noise that might be there. And this is, well, a similar table to what I showed you for the 16th century, a similar table for the 18th century, and this is for the corpus of the 20th century. But what do you do with that? How do you compare? You can approximately decide that the values, I cannot move, but the values are similar, and even though the ordering varies from corpus to corpus, the affixality values are different. So I started looking for ways to compare these. And you probably know all these measurements, text mining measurements that allow you to make searches in internet. So I tested some of those. And of course, there must be more, but this is just a first approach. They rely on word frequency comparison. And of course, I'm not dealing with frequencies here. I'm dealing more with this affixality value. What I want to compare is this glutenosity value. The typical techniques for searching in internet is just the plain count. There is another one called the word count plus a bonus. There is cosine similarity and good old Euclidean distance, which turned out to be the best in my experience. I will briefly go through these. The word count simply finds which items are shared by all the sets of morphemes, and I don't think it is very interesting, even though each one has a set of about 500 affixal items. There is only 282 that they all have. And in order to understand this table, you can see that the 16th and the 18th century share 370 items. That's not very interesting. You could have predicted that also, that the 18th century would be more similar to the 16th, and that the 18th would be more similar than the 20th, and that the farther states will be least similar among each other. So if we apply the bonus is really a weight added to the index calculated that inhibits whatever the value of whatever item occurs in all profiles, and increases the importance of those items shared between only two of the profiles. So that may be a little tricky. And then we have a table, a similarity table. It would be then that Peninsular Spanish. Okay, I added something there that I was going to comment later. But it is interesting to remark that the 20th century and Peninsular Spanish, Mexican 20th century and Peninsular Spanish become more similar. I will talk about that because I added that to make it more interesting, and it shouldn't be there. As I said just a minute ago, the good old Euclidean distance was the most interesting, especially because you can take into account the number of shared items in the profiles. So the formula you probably know. It looks weird here because I didn't make it to look with latex, which looks better. But you can follow that. All I'm doing is subtracting the values of each item and squaring them, dividing the sum, taking an average and then squaring it back. And these are some, this is a sample of the values, of very productive values, and you will notice that it is not very productive in the 20th century Spanish, this one here. For that would have to do more for dialectal remarks that if you do not Spanish, you probably would not understand. One interesting thing is that there is a tendency for this glutinosity or affixality to grow. And if you are familiar with this grammaticalization frame of reference in linguistics, in which they say that affixes tend to specialize, to lose their semantic content and lose their phonological content and go into a very precise grammaticalization route or route. So it is interesting that at least in all the profiles, that's a tendency, but you have also the opposite tendency of a morpheme that's more or less productive in the 16th century, but loses productivity in the 20th century. Oh, that's in Spanish. Okay. There, what I did is include this similarity, this not similarity matrix, but distance matrix, and you can see that the values are really very, very small. You see that the greatest difference is between the 16th century and the 20th century, but it's just like too small in order to decide that the tendency is interesting. So that's why I added another corpus in order to have like a point of reference that would allow me to see if these distances were really or had anything to do with anything. I improvised a corpus of peninsular Spanish from their internet corpus called CREA, and I did the same. I generated the table, and I have a similar table. The important thing then would be to apply the same measurements, and it looks similar to all of them, all the others. And before I show you the distance matrix, I would include some of the interesting items. O can be an inflection, ito is a diminutive, and eria is a derivational affix. Then there I included all the paradigm of inflection of the peninsular Spanish language. If you learn Spanish here, you will probably learn this paradigm as the real one or as the truth for the Spanish language. And when you go to Latin America, you'll find out that it doesn't apply there. So, but the interesting thing is that there is a diminishment, and the dispersion, or that's just a standard deviation of the values, even in the peninsular Spanish, it appears to be important. Well, the thing is that these suffixes, inflection suffixes, do exist in Mexico, but they're not really inflectional affixes. They are like some pragmatic marker of very solemn speech or irreverent speech. So it is kind of like tricky to go to Latin America and try to use it, because people may just be a little uncertain about whether you're trying to be funny or not. Okay. So, in a similarity, a way of having a similarity measurement would be to subtract 1 from the normalized distance. And then we have that the most similar distance would be between the 18th century Mexican Spanish and Peninsular Spanish, and that in fact Mexican Spanish in the 20th century is a little farther away from Peninsular Spanish than it is from the 18th century. But again, these tendencies are only tendencies. I find it interesting to look for ways to see how significant these tendencies are, but meanwhile, they corroborate what philologists have remarked about these two dialects. I decided to go a little further and look into genetically related languages. I thought that would be a way of giving a little bit more context, and you probably know that Portuguese is the closest language to the Spanish language that there is. I also improvised a not very representative corpus from an internet corpus by Mark Davies, and I took samples from the 16th century and the 20th century. And again, this is very audacious of me to present to you as results, because there are two different languages, and the orthographic systems are definitely not the same, and spellings I could have gotten into to change some morphemes so that I would find or observe equivalences between them, but I just didn't do it because this is an exercise in written language, and the idea is to make it as unsupervised as possible. An interesting thing would be to apply phonological rules. Portuguese has very clear phonological rules, and Spanish too, so that would be interesting. But as of now, we will have only orthographic written language data. And then, so I generate a table just like the ones, like the ones you saw before, for the 16th, the 20th century, and then again, I need to compare them. Fortunately, I already tested all these measurements, and I found out that Euclidean looks better. And it is interesting to see, this is not, well, this is the distance, that the greatest distance would be, where's the greatest? Between Portuguese of the 20th century and Mexican Spanish from the 18th century. Then Mexican Spanish from the 16th century is not, it would be the one that follows. And you could see the darker ones would be the ones that have least distance. So again, the Peninsular Spanish and Mexican Spanish from the 18th century are most similar. And you can also do the similarity matrix, and then I think it is clear to see that the most similar is Peninsular Spanish and Mexican Spanish from the 18th century, and Mexican Spanish from the 20th. It is more associated to Peninsular Spanish by very little. It resembles a lot the 18th century. And one thing that would be like a control thing is that Portuguese from the 16th century is very similar to Portuguese of the 20th century, in spite of all the problems of representativity, in spite of all the problems of orthographical errors. They couldn't really be considered errors, just different conventions, I guess. As a summary, I showed you briefly an unsupervised method that can be used to measure diachronic change at the morphological level. It is useful, or I've seen it useful, at least for my language, but other dialects and languages related to this language should benefit from this. I should add that a distance, a measurement of this kind of distance should take into account other aspects of language, like the phonological level, definitely, but also whatever modifiers and clitics can be incorporated in the experiment, also discovered automatically, unsupervisedly. After all the data that I have generated, not only for Spanish, but also for the indigenous languages of Mexico that I've worked with, I can say this is very robust. So no wonder the data, at least to me, seems interesting. And lastly, we saw some comparison techniques, but definitely there must be more. Maybe you have some ideas. These experiments can be improved in many ways. I think more than affixality should be taken into account. All other association between morphemes of a different nature should be taken into account, like the clitics that I mentioned a little while ago. And definitely there must be better ways to measure this distance and similarity. And my fantasy would be that unlike the method of Swadesh that gives you millennia as the result, that we could have a measurement of some perhaps bits of change per year or per century, which would constitute a unit of measurement of the classical type. More dialects should be considered, more languages, different registers. There is the conjecture, could be said. Well, actually, the wise knowledge of certain philologists that notice that the Spanish spoken for middle classes in all of Latin America and Spain is more similar in between than the dialects of lower classes. So I can understand very well someone from Uruguay or Madrid or Lima, but it would take me a while to find out what someone of a lower class in Lima is saying. So that variation would be interesting to look into. There are other sets of genetically related languages, very close languages. Within the Maya family, we have Achug, Corpus, and Tojolabal, which is also very related. It will be interesting to see if this technique holds for them. And I have also diachronic data for languages like Purépecha that were very studied in the 16th and 17th century. And concluding remarks that had to do more with the Spanish language. I want to emphasize that most of these samples are really not very representative, not like the corpus made for the 20th century that I mentioned before. And this is of interest to Mexicans. Mexicans like to know that Mexican Spanish emerges as a distinct dialect of the Spanish language sometime between the 17th and the 18th centuries. And I think I can corroborate the idea that Spanish is, in general, a very conservative language, not in the phonological level, but at least in the morphological level it is. These dialects seem to be morphological apart. The Spanish from the Mexico of the 20th century and the Peninsular Spanish, but they are very close to the 18th century. Or it seems to be like a triangle. That's what I wanted to comment. And that's it.
Thank you for your talk. If there are some questions, please take the microphone because we want to register all the questions and answers. So, anybody wants to ask something? If not, may I have May I have a question? I just wanted to ask you, when you showed us the tables, the comparisons between the Spanish and between the Mexican and Peninsular Spanish, it was compared towards the contemporary Peninsular Spanish, not from the 16th or 18th century. Maybe.
Say the 16th century would be Spanish, Peninsular Spanish. The 18th century, that definitely is missing there.
So you have not.
No. It's just too many corpora.
Okay.
Yeah, but definitely that would be interesting to see. In several samples of similarity tables, it turned out that even the Portuguese samples looked a lot like the 18th century Spanish. So that's kind of funny.
And one other, maybe a remark. At the end, towards your talk, you showed the distances between, or you told that you can use the measures for computing distances between the registers, and wouldn't it could be quite difficult? Wouldn't it be done vice versa, just to discover registers on the basis of the distances? If you had, for instance, two corpora and wanted to wanted to discover if they are of different registers, and base the answer on the counting these distances. You have two corpora,
right.
And you don't know anything about them. And if you count the distances, maybe you can discover something about the very nature of the both corpora.
Of both corpora. Yeah. Actually, I've compared specialized speech in Spanish and the general language Spanish corpus of the 20th century, and some suffixes that you would expect to be more technical emerge as more prominent in the specialized. Yeah, so it could be, if you think, well, there's some talk about terms being sentences, multi-words, and even affixes. So you can even perhaps think of morphological term extraction or